Hello, and welcome to the Howard Townsell Show, where we teach you something for nothing. Today I'm with the guest, attorney Kimberly Jackson, and she's the owner of the Phoenix Law Firm. We're here today, we're going to talk a lot about bankruptcy, information that you just need to know. She's going to give us a whole host of information about some of the things you should do, some of the things you should avoid, and also some of the things that you just may be doing to be hurting yourself or helping yourself, and you just need to know the right information to get rid of all the myths. So today, welcome, Ms. Kimberly Jackson.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
What I would like to do is I would like to go ahead and get started. The first question I want to ask you is, what exactly does bankruptcy mean? Does it mean you're just over your head in your debts, or what exactly does it mean?
That's a good question, and I want to answer it in two parts.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, bankruptcy implies that, yes, you don't have enough assets to pay your obligations. But in fact, there are many people who are in the situation of not having enough assets to pay their obligations that are not what's called bankrupt. Bankrupt is a legal designation. It is a specific legal designation that you've got to get only by going through the court process and getting the court to discharge your debts one way or the other through one of the various chapters that's available. And so it's a legal designation that literally protects you from creditors so that you have a certain amount of room, hopefully, if done correctly, a certain amount of assets with which you can start rebuilding your life post-bankruptcy. So it's an actual, it's a legal designation. It's not just, I don't have enough money. That's insolvency.
Right.
It's an actual protection that protects you from creditors in the event of financial chaos or stress.
Is there more than one type of bankruptcy proceeding?
There is. There are actually four. The most common are the Chapter 7, which is an individual bankruptcy or a small business bankruptcy. There's the 13, that is for individuals only. And then there's the Chapter 11, which people hear in the news, the businesses that do business reorganizations.
Right.
And then there's the 12 that deals with fishermen and farmers, which is kind of a special designation. I primarily practice in the 7s and the 13s.
Okay.
And those are the ones that you hear most often about in the media and other places, because other than the Chapter 11, of course, which is for businesses, but with people and married couples and small businesses, you're hearing about the 7s and 13s.
Now, how can bankruptcy help anyone, just a person out there right now that's struggling and they just don't know exactly which way to turn? I mean, a lot of times you have people who their assets are just starting to diminish and they just don't know which way to go. And, you hear these myths about don't file bankruptcy. And that could just very well be the opposite of what they need to be hearing. Can anyone file bankruptcy? How can bankruptcy help anyone?
You've asked a lot of questions. Let me try to break those down into separate issues. Can anyone file bankruptcy?
Right.
There are certain rules to bankruptcy. You've got to qualify to do a bankruptcy. There are certain things you can do. There's a class that you have to take pursuant to the laws that were changed in 2005. There are certain income issues that will qualify you or disqualify you between a 7 and a 13. Some of this would take a whole nother show to talk about.
And we'll do it. We'll do it.
But in general, and if you filed before, of course, there are some limitations to when, not if, but when you can file again and qualify for another discharge. And the discharge, and I just want to clarify that the discharge is the discharging of outstanding debts by creditors who have claims against you.
Okay.
In terms of how it helps, everyone's situation is a little different. And to go back to the types of bankruptcies, you've got the Chapter 7. And the Chapter 7, think about that as what's called a straight bankruptcy. It's what people typically think about when they think about bankruptcy. A Chapter 7 is when you make less than a certain amount of money, depending on your number of household occupants, and you make a certain amount of money. And as long as you make less than the median income in your jurisdiction, you can file for a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. There are a few other rules, but just generally speaking, broad strokes, that's how it works. And then if you do everything you need to do and we get all the information in and you do what the court asks you to do and you get your discharge, then your creditors literally are just erased. The creditors go away, the debt is discharged, and you use the next years to rebuild your life.
Okay.
The 13 is a little different. The 13 is more of a rehabilitation. It's what's called a wage earner's bankruptcy. So that means you make more than the median income, and that given your expenses, there seems to be a disposable amount of income every month that we could use to pay back your creditors. That goes into a pot. You may not pay back the entire amount that you owe a creditor, but you may pay back a percentage. It may, there are some very low dollar plans, 1% plans, and there are some 100% plans. So it really varies person to person. But what it can do as an overall protection, and again, it's bankruptcy protection, and that's what people, I think, don't really understand. They look at it as a badge of shame sometimes, and not for what it really is, because what it really is protection in the event of stresses.
Right.
And sometimes those stresses become chaotic.
Exactly. Sometimes
they don't. Sometimes it's just good planning. Sometimes it's good common sense. So to go back to your question, how can it help? In a variety of ways. Let's say you're getting sued by a creditor, and you want to deal with that, and you don't want to have to go to court on that, and you don't have the money to pay this creditor. It will stop a lawsuit from going on and matriculating through the system and possibly going to judgment against you. In the event that you've had a judgment, and unfortunately, hopefully we'll talk about this a little later, but what sometimes happens is that people have claims filed against them in a state court, and they ignore them, and then they get a default judgment. And then that can turn into either wage or bank account garnishment by the creditor.
Right.
So then you're working really hard, and you're already under stress, and now some creditor is taking a certain percentage of your paycheck or putting a hold or freezing your bank accounts to get what they're owed through oftentimes a default judgment, which is, it's just a really, really unfortunate situation. So a bankruptcy will stop a garnishment. It can halt as long as we get into the situation in an appropriate amount of time. It can stop you from getting evicted. If someone is going to lose their license, and especially for people who have to drive to get back and forth to work or have a commercial license, it can stop your license from being taken away from you. It can stop you from having to deal with foreclosures, having to deal with repossessions. Those are just, a variety of things. Everyone's situation is a little different. And while there are certain things that you can avoid, for instance, if you owe the IRS, you owe the IRS. But it will put us in a position that maybe we'll have more options. And maybe we can work with the IRS through the bankruptcy process to get you in the best position possible. So there's a variety of ways. It's really a holistic. It's been around for a very long time. So it's got a lot of different arms to it. And it kind of, envelops the debtor who's in a bad situation and helps in many, many ways that people aren't even aware of. And then there's a few strategic things that we can talk about too.
Yeah, in particular, let's say that a person is just completely over their head in debt. And I know that there are certain people that just don't know the specific steps to take in order to, get from under this situation. Are there any debts that are not discharged through bankruptcy?
There are. There are. Right now, student loans are not discharged, and that's a hot topic in the media because that's something that I think this administration is considering and looking at, and something certainly the financial community has to look at, because student loans are now becoming the #1 loan and creating the biggest burden on our individuals who are trying to get out of this recession and get back on their feet. So student loans, unfortunately, are not dischargeable. Taxes are not dischargeable. And there are some nuances to that, and there's some things that you can do only through the bankruptcy process that in certain situations, again, it's a whole nother list of technical talk that may kind of take us too far down another road,
Right.
but there are situations where we can even work with you on some of your taxes in certain circumstances. But generally speaking, student loans, taxes, obviously, child support or court-imposed debts, there's certain court-imposed debts that are not dischargeable. Criminal restitution, sometimes personal injury cases where someone was hurt. There are certain things that are not dischargeable, but generally, most of the time, people's debts are more of the, either dealing with this real estate market that's gone haywire, maybe they've lost a job or they've become underemployed. They have a situation with unsecured debt where perhaps the credit card situation got out of control and they don't have that ability to pay, not, for whatever reason. And another big one is divorce and medical bills. So those are typically the big areas that really cause the problem.
My question would be to you, what is the one common area where most people will come to you and say, I can't do it anymore, and I think I need to file bankruptcy? So what is the most common area that people come to you about and say they just can't continue to go through what they're going through financially because of this or because of that?
Well, there are two classes of people. One are the homeowners who unfortunately may have had a situation in the last few years as we've been going through this financial stress, not just even individually, not just nationally, but globally.
Right.
And they've been having a really hard time. Maybe they've gotten behind in their payments. Maybe something's happened where they're facing a foreclosure, they can't get remodified, and they don't know what they want to do with the home. Either they've decided, hey, I want to let it go, or I want to try to hold on to it. And so then we've got to look at what your options are under those circumstances. So that's really the big one with homeowners is this mortgage payment. And especially when homes are still so underwater, so to speak, meaning, they are not worth nearly what's owed, often on the first mortgage, but even more often on the second and sometimes third mortgages. And to go back to one of the ways that bankruptcy can help, the Chapter 13, for instance, in an underwater home situation, there's a mechanism that allows us to get rid of those second and third mortgages on an underwater home, a home that's undervalued, when compared to its mortgage. So that's the one case. People have a lot of hard time dealing with financial decisions, and what you thought was going to be this lifelong investment has kind of turned sour, and what are you going to do about it? If you're going to go through with a foreclosure, I'm not a financial person, but many financial analysts, and I agree with their assessment, many very good ones will tell you that if you're going to go through a foreclosure, you should definitely consider bankruptcy. Because in addition to the fact that you may lose your home, and sometimes even with a short sale as well, in addition to the fact that you're going to lose your home through the foreclosure, that doesn't mean that the debt's gone away.
Right. True.
It just means that the foreclosure has happened. You will have a deficiency likely, not only with the first, but again, oftentimes the second and the third. And the problem is, one is there's the headache of this debt, that the debt collectors will come with, a lot of force and a lot of rigor and try to get their money from you. But then there's also legally the obligation that can follow you around for a lifetime. And you could be sued many years down the line thinking, oh, well, I was foreclosed on, they understand, the house wasn't worth what it was supposed to be worth. People don't really realize that, no, they've got to meet their budgets too. And if there's a way to squeeze you, oftentimes that's in fact what happens. So then you've got another headache. So those are the homeowners. The non-homeowners are typically facing a situation where there's been job loss, perhaps a car loan situation has gotten out of control, or they've got a lot of credit card collectors calling and calling and calling and harassing them. You don't want to pick up the phone, you don't want to answer the door, you don't want to read your mail, because it's just stressful.
I understand.
And, no one wants to live like that.
Right.
And another interesting point is that a lot of times it's not during the worst of a recession that people tend to file bankruptcy. It's like now when economic indicators are starting to look more positive, because people, if you don't have anything, you don't have anything to pay, and what are they really going to do? There's a sense of paralysis that tends to kind of happen, but people start they finally get a job.
Right.
And then they start looking at their obligations and they're thinking, well, I have this much to start rebuilding, but all that debt over there is going to be a big problem for me. So how am I going to get this done? And then a light bulb sometimes goes off and they're like, you know what? I'm going to ease my burden a little bit and think about my options and figure out, how much of this I can legally and ethically get rid of.
Right.
And start rebuilding my life now that I've gone from, sometimes even 2 or 3 years of unemployment to getting a paycheck for the first time. I can do it, but I can't do it if I've got to carry around all that extra debt.
Let's talk about the length of time that the bankruptcy proceeding takes. How long does the bankruptcy process take?
Again, okay, so each situation is different. With a Chapter 7, which is the straight bankruptcy, that process is typically on average about 90 days from start to finish. Once you get all your documents in to your attorney or your preparer, once you get everything together and you file it, typically it is over start to finish in 90 days. There's one hearing that you have to go to. It's not in a court, it's in a hearing room, and it's before the trustee, and it's called a meeting of the creditors. And it's usually a very short meeting. Typically that's not a long process, very doable for people that are intimidated by the court process. But it is a meeting to just make sure that everything is in order. And then the trustee gives a report, the court makes a decision, and you can often get your discharge on average in about 90 days. Chapter 13s are different. Chapter 13, again, is a rehabilitation. So there's a repayment plan that's embedded in the Chapter 13 process. And those are either going to be a minimum of 36 months, 3 years, or a maximum of 60 months, 5 years. And so there's a little bit more to those. But again, there are some very valuable tools in the Chapter 13 process for the wage earner who may just need a little time. They may be making good money, but they may be still overwhelmed with debt, managing creditors, facing foreclosure, facing court judgments, facing just headaches and harassment. And they just need a little time and a little space to get back on their feet, and that's what a 13 will do. And in addition, sometimes you can get rid of a second and third mortgage as well. Yeah.
You and I have talked before, and I've heard you talk a little bit about how the bankruptcy is part of the purview of wealth management. Why do you say that?
And I'm glad you asked that as well. So wealth management. Wealth management, we typically think of wealth management as a way to build wealth, as a way to make extra income, and that's perfectly acceptable. That is a part of wealth management. What's missed sometimes is that there's a very important part of wealth management that's also safeguarding against loss. And if people find themselves in a situation where they may create for themselves more loss than is necessary, then they've not managed that situation as well as it could have been managed. So when it comes to bankruptcy, again, to just drive the point home, we're talking about protection. There's a certain amount that you get to keep that the creditors can't get you. The bankruptcy literally comes around you like a cape, and it protects you from the creditors' harassment. It protects you from lawsuits, but it also allows you to keep a certain amount of assets in order to rebuild your life. Embedded in the bankruptcy philosophy is the philosophy that people need something. They need a roof over their head. They need a way to rebuild once this financial stress or catastrophe has happened. And so we don't want to strip them down to nothing. We want to make sure that people are in a position to be able to, care for their families in such a way that they can rebuild and go forward and become productive members of society again, in the sense of financial society.
Right.
And so part of wealth management is also protecting against that, and that's something that you're able to do through this process in a way that you cannot do through any other process. The court is really, your friend. It's your protector in this situation, and it protects you from situations where, you wouldn't otherwise be able to protect yourself. There's nothing else that can shield you from that.
What do you think are the biggest mistakes that people can make when they start to have financial difficulties? You're starting to have these financial difficulties, and you go about trying to make your own decisions. And you go. Sometimes people actually go to the internet and they read up a couple things and they think they got it all, and they go in and they start making these decisions. What are some of the biggest mistakes that people make when they actually find themselves in financial difficulty?
Well, one of the things, like you said earlier, people make assumptions, for instance, about the bankruptcy process. Right. They don't go when they get informed. And many of my colleagues, very, very, very good attorneys, give free consultations. I give free consultations. And that's a very important process. If information is free, go out and get it. Mm-hmm. Find out what's going on. Make the best decision you can make based on the information available. Before sometimes you even get to that point, you're at home and you've got these bills coming in and you're trying to figure out what to pay, what not to pay, what to do. And unsecured creditors are frankly a lot more aggressive often than your secured creditors, because the secured creditors, at least in theory, have a secured asset. So a lot of times people will pay unsecured creditors over secured credit. Secured credit, for instance, is your home, your car, things that you're definitely going to need in whatever phase of your life comes next. You're going to need a roof over your head, and you're typically going to need a way to get back and forth to work or to get someplace in case of emergency. So pay your secured debt first. If you're in a situation where you're thinking of borrowing money from your retirement, think twice. Because one of the things that, for instance, the bankruptcy process protects is if it's a qualified account, if it's a bona fide retirement account, your creditors don't get to take that from you. So one of the worst things I hear about is when some of my clients, especially my clients that are not in their best wage earning years, that their wage earning years are really behind them, they come in and they've depleted all of their retirement income to pay unsecured debt that would have been discharged through the bankruptcy process with money that would have been protected through the bankruptcy process. So almost never is it a good idea to use retirement income or retirement savings toward debts that are now accumulating. And that's something that you really need to sit down with professionals and talk about. And as I said, many, many professionals give free consultations and give good advice. Not paying insurance is a good one. People think, I'm not paying my mortgage, I'm not going to worry about the insurance. As long as your name is on that property, you are liable for whatever happens on that property. And you don't want to get into a situation that you've got an undervalued house and then you've got some sort of legal claim against you. It's always harder to get insurance once you've let it lapse. So keep your insurance in place, keep your car insurance in place, make sure you do those kinds of things. And before you go borrowing money from friends and creating just more drama and headache for yourself, think about your options to what you can do independent of all of that to really make some good qualified decisions and not have to go down that road.
You know that a lot of times people tend to hold off, or they procrastinate on making decisions about filing bankruptcy because of the shame that sets with it. Do you find that people are ashamed to file bankruptcy, and why do you think that is?
I do, and it's so unfortunate because it's a logical decision. This is a financial situation that has to have a logical response, and the idea of shame is something that is just really off topic, frankly. It's something that's someplace else. And it's not that I don't understand that, because, so many of us are raised with those ideas. If you create debt, you've got to pay those debts, and that's what, good people do. And I get that. But what's not really, discussed is, well, what happens if there's an unforeseen event? What happens if I didn't, expect to be laid off, but I was? What happens if I develop a catastrophic illness and my insurance doesn't cover it, and now I've got these bills that I can't pay, or my house that I've been thinking is the centerpiece to my financial plan is now worth a third or half of what I actually am paying for.
Which is happening today.
Which is happening today. It doesn't talk about the eventuality of what happens when the surrounding circumstances go sour, and there's nothing that we can do as individuals really to get ourselves out of that. So what I say to that is really try to take the emotion out of it and try to make it an informed decision. We hear about, some celebrities. There's recently, there was news about, well, is Allen Iverson going to file? He's got his financial problems. There's T-Boz from that musical group that recently filed. And people tend to think, well, they must have mismanaged their money. Well, maybe not. Maybe there's just circumstances that happen. And what's interesting is that, just in the last 6 months, you've had Hostess file bankruptcy. You had Kodak file bankruptcy.
Right.
And no one seems to think anything of it when a company files bankruptcy. But if
when
you
an
think of
individual
it,
does it, then there's a big deal.
but if you think of it, a company has, a marketing department, an advertising department, a finance department, an R&D department. I mean, they've got a team of smart people, groups and groups and groups of smart people, and sometimes they can't withstand the economic downturn. Individuals are much less, resourced to guard against these kinds of things and eventualities. And so if you think about it logically, it's just something that happens, and it's happening more and more, obviously, in this economy. And all I can say is, make a sound, well-informed decision and just try to keep the emotion out of it, because, you will be in a much better position if you make a logical decision than an emotional decision when it comes to money.
This is a big one. We know that bankruptcy does affect your credit score. And there's some people who don't understand the value of having a great credit score. What about filing bankruptcy? How bad does it affect your credit score?
It is a catastrophic entry on your, there's no way around that.
Right.
The truth of the matter is, if you were considering bankruptcy, you have already had a catastrophic entry on your credit report. And likely, you're in a position where you're going to have more than one. Unlike offending for it on your own, and when you do that, when I say, without the protection of a professional coming in and helping you and showing you the things that you need to know, if you don't get that kind of know-how and take some steps to intervene, what happens is, creditors, you don't know when they're going to report these things. Maybe they'll sell your debt to another, sub-creditor.
It happens.
And it hasn't gotten written off yet. Maybe it's written off here, but not here. And then, 6 months, 12 months down the line, then it gets written off. So then that hits your credit report. Well, meanwhile, another creditor across town, they haven't made their decision yet. So that's going to hit, 6 months, maybe 12 months later. And then that starts the 7-year cycle. So these things happen, and then, if you're facing, unfortunately, a foreclosure, which is a huge deal on your credit report, or missed mortgage payments are a huge deal on your credit report. Yeah. You already sustained some really, really ugly black marks, in some ways, TKOs on your credit report.
Exactly.
So if you're going to live the responsibility of a bad credit score, you should get the privilege of what comes with that. And while bankruptcy is there's no question but that bankruptcy is a big deal. It is something that rounds up all your creditors at one time. So we have one start time, one definitive start time, and one definitive stop time. And what people don't understand is when they don't get control of the situation, it can go on far longer than a bankruptcy. In the case of a Chapter 7, the bankruptcy typically stays on your report for 10 years. In the case of a Chapter 13, it's typically 7 years that it stays on your report. You've got to stay on your reporting bureaus and make sure that, they stop reporting it after the required amount of time. But that's, and when I say typically, that's barring a mistake.
Right.
It's supposed to be 7 and 10 years respectively. But if you don't often go through this process and you have a lot of creditors hitting your report at different times, you can get bad reports far beyond 10 years.
Right.
And you don't have any control over that process. So this is yet another aspect of it, of an individual taking control of the situation rather than the situation taking control of the individual.
Okay, we have about 1 minute left, and I just want to ask you one more question. How does debt reorganization, reconstruction, and the reconsolidation compare to bankruptcy? How does all of that comprise?
People have to be very careful about debt consolidation companies. Many of them, frankly, are owned by creditor companies. Some of them are not, what we would call reputable. I'm not saying that they're not some reputable companies, because of course there are, but you've got to be so careful. They're not as controlled as attorneys are. I mean, attorneys answer not only to the courts, but to our bar associations, and we've got specific rules that we have to follow. The nice thing, I think, and what I try to explain to my clients is, for instance, my fee is part of the petition. So you have a lot of protection when you go the bankruptcy route that you don't get through the debt consolidation company. Unfortunately, sometimes these companies themselves file bankruptcy. And oftentimes I have situations where clients come in, they've paid thousands of dollars to a debt consolidation company. Not a single debt has gone away, and now the debt consolidation company has filed bankruptcy itself. So there's just not the same level of oversight. So if you want to go down a road where you're concerned about what's going to happen, what do I have to be protected from, those are things you want to keep in mind. You want to go a route where there's a lot of oversight.
Well, that has been just the whole wealth of information. I've learned so much myself. I hope our viewers have learned a lot. I want to thank you guys for coming to the Howard Townsell Show, where we're teaching you something for nothing, and we learned a lot today. And I want to thank my guest, attorney Kimberly Jackson with the Phoenix firm. And just know, guys, you have to take this serious, because you never know when it's you. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you.